Thank you. You've got half an hour whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's said by the favorite poet of our president, President Jokowi, Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese, that after eating and drinking, the most important need for humanity is the hearing of stories. So allow me to tell you a story which will be tangentially connected to the business at hand in your discussion this afternoon. So this Pache Yates is Monuments of Unageing Intellect, how Raffles and his Interregnum regime museumized Java. Next slide. So one thing which is completely airbrushed out of the record, if you look at the history of Java, is that it was underpinned by stunning violence. Both times in the modern period when the British were involved briefly in modern Indonesia, they carried out massacres. The first was in Jakarta, in Jatinegara, Kampung Melayu, and the second was in Surabaya, the 10th to the 20th of November. The first was the attack on Daendel's great fortification at Meister Cornelis, and the second was the revenge of the death of a British general, A.W.C. Malaby. Next slide. And as an adjunct of that came a great deal of asset stripping. When the Kraton of Jogja fell, the entire library, barring some beautifully calligraphed Quran, were carted away. Raffles took some, but the majority went to Crawford and to Mackenzie, Crawford then being the resident of Jogja, and Mackenzie being the chief engineer officer, besides 800,000 Spanish dollars, which is equivalent of 120 million in US dollars today, which was sent to Bengal to pay officers' salaries. Next slide. And even the dead were not allowed to rest in peace. This is John Deans, born in Fife, died, he's a Scot, who was very successful in Java. He was the secretary, assistant resident in Jogja, and then set up a very well-regarded firm in Semarang called Scott Deans & Co. He was in charge of the contingent which was involved on the southern alon of the Kraton, on the morning, early morning of the Saturday, the 20th of June. And it was under his direction that the troops were able to encircle and kill the Jogja army commander who was sheltering in his private mosque. So there was no semblance that a place of worship, as there was in the Middle Ages, might be sacrosanct. But he was not content with that. He wanted to take the equivalent of an early 19th century selfie. So he unsheathed his heavy cavalry sword and attempted to cut off the head of the dead army commander, whose body would lay in the mosque until the whole of his residence was burnt to the ground, and he was only buried at 10 p.m. that night. Yeah, this is never mentioned in any of the accounts which we hear. But underlying this colonial project was a huge and almost tidak dibendung, undamned application of shock and awe. Next slide. And Raffles had, and so did his assistants, a particular view of Javanese culture. Their view of Javanese culture was that there was a culture which was adiluhung, which was noble, elevated, worthy of respect and worthy of maintaining. And there was a sad falling off, which had come about because of the coming of Islam. So in this page, you see on the left-hand side an Al-Quran, and on the right-hand side, the Jal Ankara Wulang, 1804 text, beautifully calligraphed and illustrated. And it's significant for me that the only documents he left in the court, which was almost totally gutted, library, were Al-Quran copies, beautifully calligraphed copies. Next. And one area of monument which he was involved with was Majapahit. He decided in 1815 that Majapahit needed to be surveyed. This means that the royal city of Trowulan is unique. It's like Mohenjo-daro or Harappa. It's a court city which had remained largely intact, although under the ground. And in October of 1815, he dispatched an army surveyor by the name of Captain J.W.B. Vardenar. Next slide. Raffles had visited in 1815, May 1815. It had seen the Sangguran, which was just then a sheet of rice cultivation surrounded by a noble forest of teak. And it was following that visit in May of 1815 that he delegated Vardenar to make his October survey. Next slide. Vardenar's mother was Javanese, so he was a fluent Javanese speaker. He wasn't your normal Semarang graduate from the military college, Naval College in Semarang. But he was trained as a surveyor, a military surveyor. And he came to Trowulan, and in the space of 2 weeks, he produced this very detailed map. He found about 80 families living. It was mainly forested. There was a branch of Dynal's Trans-Java Highway nearby, linking what would later be Japan, Mojokerto after 1838, and Jombang. But he carried out a very significant early survey. Next slide. What he found was that gradually, this is the Candi Mutaran, which has now disappeared, and this is on the right, the Ringin Lawang, which has been completely rebuilt under the Dutch in the 20th century. What he found was significant archaeological remains, but very much falling into ruin, and with significant artifacts which were later moved. Next slide. The artifact which was moved was this, the known by its nickname, the fat boy, Joko Dolok, Akshobhya, which was the long thought to be a statue of King Katanagara, the king who had ruled before the founding of Majapahit, 1293, but in fact has been proven by research to be the figure of the sage monk Barada, who took the Toyo Sakti from heaven to divide the kingdom between Janggala and Doho Kediri, between Erlanga's two sons, the king of Kahuripan, who abdicated in 1045, died in 1049, and his realm was divided after his reign. And the figure who did this was the sage monk Barada, whose hermitage, wooden hermitage, was discovered by MacLean Pont in 1926, 11th century hermitage. And this statue is now in the Taman in Simpang in Surabaya. Next slide. When Raffles came back, he brought with him 30 tons of Javanese artifacts, some of which, such as his numismatic collection, have never been described. So, as with the Sangguran inscription, which is yet to be properly deciphered and properly translated and properly published, a great deal of Raffles' collection is still really uncurated and lacks proper description. But it was on the basis of his work, The History of Java, his Orza as someone who had been lieutenant governor of what was then an extremely fashionable subject, Java. Even milkmaids from Devon dressed up as Javanese princesses to insert themselves into London polite society, that he was knighted in May of 1817 by the Prince Regent. What is interesting, I mean, his book is History of Java is obviously a work of plagiarism because he rested very heavily on the work of Engelhardt and the Dutch collectors of the late 18th and early 19th century, and he also had many local informants like Notokusumo, who became Paku Alam, and Surya de Mongolo in Semarang, and Paku Ningrat, the Sultan of Sumenep, who were barely mentioned, is the detail of his maps. This is the steel engraving of the Walker map, which is, it's like Bentham's Panopticon. It's the first time that a very, very detailed map of Java and its resources, and not only its resources, but also all the landing points which the British could use if they had to retake Java from the south coast, were described. But what is significant is that in this whole of this magnum opus, which was 2 volumes, printed in 700 ordinary and 300 deluxe copies, there is no mention really and no inclusion of Vardana's map. And one has to ask why. Next slide. It seems that we've heard a very interesting talk and presentation from a mineralogist, a geologist, that Raffles, and probably shared by his cohort of assistants, saw that there was a clear material divide between Andesite ruins, which were like Prambanan and Borobudur and the great temples of East Java, and ruins which are made of baked brick. And since Majapahit, the royal town, Trowulan, was constructed of baked brick, hardened baked brick, of great quality, it was not seen as being adiluhung enough, more like a sort of southern Balinese puri than what Raffles imagined to be a proper court city for a great empire like Majapahit. So it may be for this reason that it was overlooked. Next slide. It may be too that because obviously this is a tapal batas of the modern age in Java. In Troloyo, the inscriptions which were deciphered by Louis Charles Dame in the 1950s, one finds Nisan headstones which bear the sunburst symbol of the royal family of Majapahit, but also are clearly Islamic Nisan tombstones, indicating perhaps that in the inner core of the family, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika included also Islam. So not only there are 2, yet there is 1 in terms of the coxing and boxing between Buddhism and Hinduism, Hayam Wuruk being a devout Shivaite and his grandmother, Gayatri, being a very devout Buddhist. There was also the inclusion of Islam. So this is the beginning of the worm which destroyed Java in terms of Raffles' vision. And maybe that's another reason why he overlooked including Majapahit. Next slide. So basically, by overlooking Majapahit, not including it, not writing it up in letters of light, as it should have been in the history of Java, as a great and important East Javanese-based quote-unquote empire, which left its calling cards throughout NTT and right up into the Straits of Malacca. It sort of fell into an oubliette, a memory hole. Next. It was not unknown, the Gelgel, and in particular, the royal court of Gelgel in Bali made visits there in the 18th century. They went on sort of extended picnics, but it was not sort of brought into the body of the Kirk in terms of a subject which was worthy of serious study. And what was worse was that the legend, Vardana's legend, and his map were separated by 12,000 miles of ocean. His map remained in the hands of relatives of Raffles. Mrs. Drake eventually gave it to the British Museum in 1939, and his annotated legend for the map was taken and bequeathed to the Batavias Genootschap after his death in 1869, where it was discovered and described and published by Rogier Verbeek, a very famous volcanologist and scientist of the late 19th century. And he did an article on the remains of Majapahit in 1815 and 1887 when he did his own survey. Next slide. So after the return of the Dutch, which significantly was on the 17th of August, 1816, when the tricolour flew again from all the government buildings in Batavia, the Dutch, who had a strong Minderwaardigheids complex vis-a-vis the British, under whose aegis under whose sufferance they actually got their colony back and retained their colony because it was screened by the great power of the Royal Navy until it was destroyed in the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942 and eventually replaced by the Seventh Fleet. But they brought in a worthy Prussian scientist called C.G.C. Reinwarth, and they brought him in really to outdo the British, to do something which was even more monumental than the history of Java. That was their hope, that he would come as a scientist and he would épater les bourgeois by essentially producing a book which would be a gown, a big splash. Next slide. But the worthy Prussian entirely lacked the chutzpah of Raffles. Raffles, if he'd been in the modern age, would have had a sort of Musk-type media account for himself and lots and lots of Twitter accounts, and he would have played the social media. Reinwarth didn't play the social media. He didn't produce the big book. He did produce the Reinwarth Commissie, and he did found the Botanic Garden in Bogor, but he never really went to town on trying to outdo Raffles, and in that case, Majapahit was also then didn't have a second chance. Next slide. And obviously, it was completely forgotten in the alarms excursions of the Java War, which cost the Dutch 20 million guilders in debts, lost some 15,000 soldiers, and bankrupted them pretty much, so that when Belgium rose in revolt on the 23rd of August 1830, they had minimal resources to be able to crush that revolt. Next slide. So we now venture into territory which is not really your brief, but it's part of the story after the Java War. Obviously, the Dutch are intent on profit and immediate profit, as Raffles noticed when he dined with the king in Brussels in July of 1817. And Van den Bos was the architect of that, and the cultivation system netted the Dutch 832 million guilders, which in purchasing power parity terms is about 11 trillion US dollars. 1 year cycle of the US economy. Next slide. And part of that wealth, next slide, was obviously sugar. And what had been Majapahit was then subsumed in the sugar frontier. So far from being chasse gardée, something which had only 80 families in 1815, became heavily peopled with people moving into the area as day laborers and setting up living quarters in the areas around Mojokerto and what had been Troulan. The only recourse which the local population had to protect their heritage was to create punden, grave sites, which the Dutch didn't dare to enter. But what was found was that the bricks, the hard red bricks of Majapahit were excellent building materials for the new sugar factories. Next slide. So there is a Majapahit brick, and it was used extensively, a chausier, in Mojokerto, in private and government sugar factories and installations. So what happened in Majapahit was not only neglect, it was a victim of Raffles' idea of what was adiluhung and what was worthy of being preserved in a museum culture and what was not, but also it was destroyed. It was an archaeological site, which, if you believe that Bubat happened and that there was a defeat and the killing of Pitaloka's, Putri Pitaloka's entourage under the orders of Gajah Mada, and this is a revenge of the Sundanese against the Javanese, you couldn't have imagined a more robust revenge, because basically the ground was dug down 7 meters to find earth which you could bake bricks for. Next slide. So when they were out of bricks, when they'd stripped out Majapahit, they began to actually create a local cottage industry, which was the production of bricks. And by the time I went there in the early 2000s, 1,500 people were involved. Family firms were involved in producing bricks, not only for Trowulan, but for the whole of East Java. Next slide. So the landscape was dug down, medieval Majapahit reappeared, Trowulan, the royal city, reappeared, only to disappear before our eyes. The wonderful collection of ceramics of Majapahit pottery and sculptures, which the late Ajidame collected, that could never be done now. Next slide. And into this very compromised situation came 2 very well-intentioned amateurs. One at the bottom is Maclean Pont, who was an architect who designed ITB and various very beautiful Javanese churches. And his colleague, the Bupati, Kromojoyo Adinegoro, who was retired by the time by the time Maclean Pont moved there in 1923, having sold his Samarang architecture firm and moved into the forester's cottage in what was then the area of Trowulan, still wooded area of Trowulan. So what did these 2 amateurs do? Next slide. They produced and surveyed and created a museum, which maddeningly, lots of locals were encouraged to produce artifacts, which were then brought into the museum, but none of those artifacts was ever dated or the provenance given. They also produced maps, and in 1926, Maclean Pont did with his own money, an extremely important excavation, which was the excavation of Barada's hermitage. But he was also, because he was paid by the sugar industry, responsible for a big red herring in the history of Majapahit, which is the idea that Majapahit is crisscrossed. It's like Venice or Amsterdam or Bangkok, crisscrossed by canals. I know that Java is an area of keajaiban, but I refuse to believe that water can travel uphill, which it would have to do if you were going to have a canal system of that gigantism. So there's a legacy, a poisoned legacy. Next slide. And an even more poisoned legacy by the Oudheid Kundigedienst, which came into being in 1913. There's Cairn, there's Brandes, who description and epigraphical work on the Sangguran inscription we've just heard about. There's Vistarini, who is an architect from Surabaya, who presided over a very important excavation, which discovered the walls of the Kadaton, 2.6 kilometers of walls of the inner court of Trowulan. There is the most gifted archaeologist of the Dutch period, Stutterheim, and there is himself, Ravana, Van Steen Kallenfelds, and the Javanese all thought it totally appropriate that he should die in Sri Lanka. of a heart attack. Next slide. And what happened was that under the aegis of the Oudheidkundige, really important research was done. Stutterheim's Nachtschloss, his sort of, amongst his papers was his description of Majapahit, Trewullan as a royal city in 1942, which remained in draft form and was published by Bosch as a VKI, Verhandelingen van het Kerkelijk Institute in 1948, after the war. But one has to question, next slide, why, given these very important discoveries, discoveries which went on onto the very eve of the Japanese invasion. This is Wim Willems, who excavated the Sittinggill with money which Charles van der Plaats got, a considerable amount of money, 20,000 guilders, from the Dutch Netherlands Indies government, and then covered it over again. Why this was not bruited about, why this was not made public in a way which would have incontrovertibly fixed where the royal court was, where the royal city was, described the royal city in all its detail, and not have to wait to bury this evidence. So why did this not happen? Next slide. Well, one of the reasons why it didn't happen is that the Indonesians, with their nationalist movement, was saying, well, I told you so. I mean, we had Majapahit. When the Bung Kecil made his famous speech in the 14th of August, 1947, to say that, well, Indonesia on la parole, Indonesia has a right to speak. Long before the Dutch came, we had Srivijaya and Trewullan, we had Majapahit, and we had a great empire which stretched over what is now most of the archipelago. If they had made that public, it would have proven the point of the Indonesian nationalist movement. So it could be that they were caught in a bind, the Oudheidkundige, that they wanted to peddle softly, because if they didn't peddle softly and they bruited it about with lavish coffee table books on Majapahit and in all its glory, which they'd found with their excavations, then the nationalists would have turned around and said, well, I told you so. What are you doing here? Next slide. So unfortunately, we've lived in the aftermath of neglect, of Raffles' museumization, his idea that only andesite remains are worthy of respect and recording, the fact of the Oudheidkundige internal quarrels, and the fact that most of their work was done in the interwar years when the Pergerakan was at its height, and the gigantism of Maclean Pont and Kromojoyo Adinegoro, really not content with a royal court, which is more like the Puri of southern Bali than what they envisaged would be a sort of Mohenjo-daro Harappa of East Java, and the fact that very skilled research, which was done by Cardono Damayuwono, Enschede trained geomorphologist in 1981, was basically spurned because it was not seen to be proving a particular thesis about Majapahit, which contained this incredible canal system. Next slide. So what is the future of Majapahit? Well, the future of Majapahit archaeologically is still open, despite the manifold disappointments and hoaxes. Disappointments which date back over 200 years to the fact that Raffles never deemed it essential to publish Wadenaar's little map, a small map, which Mixik actually saw in an exhibition in Singapore in the 1990s and never recognized. I found it back again on the 12th of March, 2008. And I can imagine why the British Museum loses so many of its objects, because it was Victorian in the way I had to find it, sitting amongst a great pile of card catalogues. I did find it. I couldn't ride my bike back because somehow the Devas of Majapahit had locked it. And I had to get wire cutters to try and actually get back to Paddington Station. But the future of Majapahit is open. This is a little story which you've probably heard many times, but I repeat it for you today. Terima kasih, matur nuwun. Ngantos kepanggih malih.
Before we go for lunch, thank you, Peter. I'm going to allow 2 questions at the expense of your lunchtime because you have Pempe already. Peter, are we okay for quick questions?
Yep, yep.
Thank you. 2 quick questions. So a lot of things are new. Adam, do you have any comments or? We'll leave it to the audience. Okay, I got dengan Mas Pangga. Pangga, silakan.
Hi, Pak Peter. This is Pangga.
Hi. Yeah.
So you mentioned a very interesting presentation about how Raffles and his contemporaries sort of forgetting or abandoning Majapahit. And if we put that into juxtaposition with the remembering of Majapahit by the Javanese scholars, like in Jogja Kraton, in Solo Kraton, I'm thinking of Babat Jawi as well.
Sure.
Kind of like interesting interaction between colonial forgetting, but also local remembering. Is that really the case, or you see a different view on that front?
All right, did you get the question?
Yeah, yeah, I heard the question. Yeah, I mean, even Diponegoro writing his memoirs and his Primbon in Makassar, Majapahit features very largely. Majapahit and Pajajaran feature. And he said Pajajaran Wusngali Kita Betawi. The mantle of Pajajaran was taken over by the town of Batavia. So there is this sort of dualism. The dualism actually went into the political Weltanschauung of the Javanese in South Central Java, that basically it was patut, okay, that the Dutch were in Batavia because they were the successors. The mantle of Pajajaran had fallen on them. All the more so because Jan Peterson Koen was able to marry the princess with flaming genitals, Mundingwangi, and had the Daulat Tuanku of sovereignty over what was deemed to be the land of the spirits, Sepriangan of West Java, which was a foreign land. When Diponegoro left Semarang, he said, Sangaji Sampun, that he left Java. Yeah, the idea of Java was the Javanese-speaking areas, the Kejawen, and Java, which Islamic Mataram had inherited Majapahit. So there is this concept of a continuity. They didn't, like Yelgel, go on picnics to Majapahit, but they did go on picnics to places like Prambanan, where Daendels was even offered breakfast when he came on his state visit in July of 1809. Smithsart, who was a completely hopeless resident before the Java War, planned a weekend away with his family and Suku and Cheto on the slopes of Mount Lawu, and was not around when the Java War was about to break out. So, there was a great understanding. Well, there was some understanding of the archaeological remains and the significance, historical significance. But when they really came into focus with Vistarini's 1930 archaeological dig, which discovered the eastern walls, it didn't uncover the western walls, there was already a sort of a catch-22 situation. I mean, what do you do as a scientist when what you discover proves the point of a nationalist movement, which is saying, jauh sebelum orang Londo di sini, kita sudah punya salah satu sejarah yang adiluhung. What do you say to people who are saying, a nationalist movement who says, well, we didn't need the Europeans to tell us about architecture, about town planning, about how to have a Bhinneka Tunggal Ika type situation, how to have a navy, or how to have a situation in which an imperial system could be born and managed from East Java. That became a sort of a real Rubik cube for the Dutch in the 1930s.
Fascinating. One quick question before we go for lunch.
There's another question.
There's another question where? Online?
Online, yeah.
Oke, Ibu ya, Ati Kisdianto, silakan.
Selamat siang, Pak Carey. I'm
Selamat siang.
really intrigued with the nasib of the brick that is being used for the sugar factory. Is there any something that's left from the sugar factory with all that bricks, or is there a possibility of doing a museum? Because I haven't been to Trowulan, I've never been there, but I remember in the 80s, a friend of mine who always have this broker who brings rings or who from Majapahit and sold it. And so people are taking all these artifacts. Are there interest of any sugar factory owner or cigarette factory owner who have lots of money to build a museum there and to preserve Majapahit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Jero Wajik's plan, which was partially implemented, was deeply destructive because he put down heavy concrete foundations into an area which was Willems had done his surveys in 1941. So tread carefully or you'll tread on my dreams. You know, you have to be very, very careful with Majapahit. There is, I mean, if you look at satellite imagery, there are hotspots of bricks like the Candi Mutaran area, which still show up on satellite imagery as a hotspot with a lot of bricks around that. So if you used satellite imagery carefully, you could reconstruct where the main lineaments, and under the ground still remains the great northern gateway to the northern alon of the Majapahit Kraton, where Gayatri, the Queen Mother, walked amidst the elephant tusks, which had, in her memoir, Drake's book on Gayatri, you can read about this. But there are still things left to discover about Majapahit. But at the moment, given the Indiana Jones attitude to these artifacts, it's better that they remain in the ground. I know where some of these are. I know where Diponegoro's Chris is. I know where his body is, but I'm not going to tell anybody because basically,
I hope there's a book for that, or if something happened to you, somebody should know about it.
Well, lovely. Let's give a round of applause for Peter.